The thing about the National Biology Teachers Association Award is literally a God thing. I'd been involved in creation now probably more than 40 years, and someone nominated me to be Teacher of the Year, and they came to my school in the early 90s, and they viewed my classes, had all these interviews, and they said, "Are you a creationist?" I said, "Yes." That ended that job. Anyway, someone nominated me back in '99. The same group came back, asked if I was a creationist. I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "We're going to award it to you anyway." Amazing. I mean, you don't hear stuff like that. And as a result of that and several other awards, I was hired by the Bureau of Education and Research in Seattle, and I gave seminars to thousands of biology teachers over an 11-year period. But teaching to me in a public school is a missionary's job. It is not just you go in there, you make your money and come home and hope you affect a few kids. It is a missionary experience. Well, let me see if I can get this thing going. It worked. Yeah. I've got 2 slides and then I'll be done, okay? Just kidding. Quick quiz. At what time of day was Adam created? Yes. A little before Eve. At any rate, I've spent 2 years studying this topic, and this is the first presentation I'm giving, so you'll be my guinea pigs or whatever you call that. But we're going to talk about what's going on in Christian intellectual circles regarding creation and evolution. Right now, I thought I would do, and this is probably a review for many of you, but if you're new to us, I thought I'd give you a review of several scenarios that are out there as far as teaching origins in a public school, public place. Origin scenario number 1 is biblical creation. God formed the universe and everything in it over a period of 6 literal 24-hour days. The earth is thousands of years old and man was made in God's image. A global flood is primarily responsible for the sedimentary rocks with their fossils in the world worldwide. And life and the world as we know it now have not always been this way. The earth that we see today has been shaped by a major catastrophe, or is it catastrophe? Okay, well, let's take a look at biblical creation. God actually did it, and there are many people who don't believe in God, or they also believe in God, but they don't believe he did that. But I think God, in an instant, created things. And I have a quick question for you. God's word in Genesis tells us that God created the universe and everything in it in 6 days. Then he rested 1 day. Let me see, 6 + 1 = 7. Isn't it interesting that the whole world today lives on a 7-day week? Where do you think our worldwide 7-day week came from? Isn't that rather curious? I think I heard someone say, yeah. Okay, quick question. Why is there so much suffering in the world? And why do we see everything in the universe, including us, deteriorating? That's a question you get all the time. And it has to go back to Adam and Eve in the Bible. And you know the story if most of you are Christians. And God cursed the creation, and ever since we've had to live on plan B. I think it's interesting here in Illinois, on farms, you see them putting in, tilling the soil and putting in fertilizer and all that. That's because of the curse. They wouldn't have to do all that if Adam hadn't done it. Global flood, not local, global. Quick question. If we find sedimentary rock thousands of feet thick with fossils in them on every continent worldwide, wouldn't it be reasonable to think that perhaps the world experienced a global flood? I mean, it's even a reasonable thought. Well, I'm going to show you some Christian intellectuals with PhDs who don't believe that at all. The result of a global flood, we have all this rock all over the world, and it's full of fossils, billions of them. And we'll mention how fossils form a little bit later. Biblical creation, how many years does this timeline represent? Well, there was a guy, he kind of wore weird clothes, but Bishop James Usher, Vice Chancellor of Trinity College, back in the 1650s, he said, you know what, you can look in the Bible and just count the genealogies, they all line up, and so you can figure out how long it was from creation until the flood. Let's take a look at what he did. So between creation and the flood, he got 1,656 years. Between then and now, he got a different number, but now it's about 4,500 years since the flood. The total for using his calculations up to now is about 6,156 years. Now, he did it by using the genealogies of the patriarchs, and I gave you a handout on that, so you can look from the time of Adam, and it goes up to the flood, and they tell you not only when someone was born, but when a person died, and so they overlap, and you can get actual data that way. So here's the creation, here's the global flood, and he counted up 1,656 years. Now, in reality, this has been done about 30 times, and I don't mean to be mean to Bishop. You could do it. I mean, just add up those numbers and you get 1,656. Anyway, then now to the present, it's 4,500 years. And here's an interesting factoid. This year is 2025. And this year on the Jewish calendar is 5786. And I had a Jewish student go ask his rabbi what that year means. And he said, quote, "It's the year since the creation." They still believe that. You can look it up on the internet. Anyway, and notice their terms, a little bit less than 6,000. What I'm showing you here at the moment, it's right around 6,000. It's a little better than 5 billion or whatever the number is. Okay, and then you think there are probably a whole bunch of ice ages and things. I think, and I wasn't there, so I don't know, but I think the evidence shows there's probably at least one large ice age after the flood. And in an icy environment, you see bears like this, polar bears. A lady from the zoo came to this veterinarian and said, "We're having trouble with our polar bear. He's happy sometimes, he's sad sometimes. Can you have the vet look at him?" The vet came in there and said, "Actually, what we have here is a bipolar bear." Can you tell I taught high school? There's scars all over my body. Okay, where does man fit in on all this? Well, the fall is here. And then they had the creation. Adam and Eve probably sinned fairly close to the creation. Then we had a global flood, and that lasted a while. And then here's what we call, in our present time, pre-flood earth is from the creation till Noah, and post-flood is from the flood until now. So we can do studies on this material in sedimentary rock if we know what it is and learn some things about it. So there's Adam to Noah. And what I find is neat, you can look at your handout sometime later, but Methuselah Adam lived long enough that he could have had lunch with Methuselah. Can you believe that? I mean, take a look at that. It's rather interesting. Birth of Christ. This is post-flood. And the point I'm making here is when you go from creation up until now, all the things that we can see as far as human form were fully human from creation. And so there was a population build up, and then God destroyed the earth and the rest of creation with a flood. And then from the flood, there's about 8 people, and they built up our population now. Now, what about hominid groups? Haven't you always wondered that? Pre-flood, I think they were all apes. And in fact, the evidence shows that they're probably apes. The most famous one of which is Australopithecus afarensis Lucy, who was discovered by Johansen in 1974, and he's been a hero ever since. And so they built that up, and they also found Paranthropus boisei. And then here's post-flood. Neanderthal was probably post-flood. And then there's Cro, and I used to always pronounce it Cro-Magnon. I was told it's Cro-Magnon, sort of like filet mignon. Anyway, let's take a look. Lucy was discovered in 1974, and they started putting it together. And these things were all assembled in 1974. And that's a skeleton they kind of made up. If you'll notice, there aren't any hands on the real discovery. And that's the organism that they got from those bones. It had no hands on it, so they couldn't tell what the hands were. And it turns out that an update, and they've rediscovered Australopithecus afarensis, it's an ape. And it has hands and feet like an ape, like a guy who used to date my daughter. Okay. What about Neanderthal? More and more is coming out about them. And we now know that they had as good as IQ as we did, or so we think. But there's Neanderthals sort of, by description, alive today. This guy is 7 feet tall, Nikolai Valuev, and he weighs 333 pounds, and he's a boxer. How would you like to walk in the ring with that guy? And the opponent says, I have to fight a Neanderthal? Are you kidding me? Then Cro-Magnon, he was the person who was famous for paintings in caves and things like that. Well, if you go on the internet, some of us do, you'll come with all kinds of proposed evolutionary trees. And the bottom of the tree, they think they are more ape-like, and then they've identified what they consider ape men. And you see all the ads on TV, and even had a TV program on it. And I'm here to tell you that I don't think there were any ape men. It's my opinion, though. So if you go to a museum and you have these things laid out as ape men, they have been studied by many, many people, and you don't realize that the world that these paleontologists live in is very cloistered. They, if you don't agree with them, they won't let you study their fossils. If you don't believe this, they won't let you do it. So I would say probably 50% of most paleontologists have not seen the major fossils on human beings. Well, how about origin scenario number 2? You maybe not have ever heard this, but it's atheistic evolution. So there's no God involved. And they come up with trees like this. And although evolutionary concepts had been discussed for many years in academic circles, it was Charles Darwin who crystallized these ideas in his groundbreaking book, The Origin of Species. And I think the guy was probably a genius. And his one book, The Voyage of the Beagle, is very well written, very entertaining. I happen to think he was wrong, but I bet he would think I was wrong too. Now, for more than 160 years, atheistic evolution has gradually captured the minds of secular and, unfortunately, some Christian scholars, establishing itself as a prominent scientific paradigm. So you'll have, in fact, I just read a statistic this week that 1 out of 4 mainline church pastors 3 out of 4 do not believe in Adam and Eve. Just 1 out of 4 pastors in mainline churches. Now, atheistic evolution was neat because he provided a plausible explanation in atheist eyes of how the diversity of life on earth came about without God. And that's the big thing. And it was plausible. They've been beating that drum for a long time. One of the most famous atheists in the world, he's in his 80s now. You've heard of him. He said, my personal feeling is that understanding evolution led me to atheism. And a lot of scholars have been led to atheism by believing some of this stuff that we had. Now, eventually, as people in the scientific community started rummaging around after Darwin, they found that they found many major academic disciplines and realized that aesthetic evolution could also provide excellent explanations for most of the dominant positions in their field. So no matter what you talk about, if you go to a lecture at the junior college or whatever, they all believe in evolution for the most part. Maybe some don't, but most of them do. Stephen Hawking had an interesting quote, and I felt it was such a waste. He was a sad man, a wonderful guy, and before his death, he said, "On humanity, we're just an advanced breed of monkeys on a major planet of a very average star." He lived all that time, wrote all those books, and that's what he believed. And you'll see what some of the people on here, like Carl Sagan and his wife in the lower right, Lynn Margulis. I've gone to hear a number of these speakers and talked with some of them, and they're not trying to deceive their audience, I don't believe. I think they really believe it, and they also are uninformed.
But the amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway.
How about with the atheistic model, God is not necessary? So I always wondered, when I got involved in this creation stuff, it's more than 40 years ago, I was just doinking along as a biology teacher for probably about 10 years. And I heard the evidence for creation, and it was like a Saul experience on the road to Damascus to me. It was amazing. And that's why they're fighting about it. They don't, many of the people that I've mentioned, they don't know that's why they're so upset. Some of them probably do. But they don't want to have anything to do with a God that they might be responsible for. And that's why they get so upset. It isn't our science is bad or we are dumb or whatever. Here's the atheistic evolution model where God isn't necessary. And this surprises me that at the beginning of atheistic evolution, what was there? Say it together. Nothing. And then there was an explosion that made everything. Now, what I don't understand, I really don't understand this. Why do people argue about the universe is expanding, it could be the Big Bang, and on and on and on? They have no case from the very beginning. Zero. So if someone wants to argue the Big Bang with me, I'd be happy to do that. I'm kind of old and frail these days. But here's what they say was going on in the timeline of atheistic evolution. So this is 15 plus billion years of evolution. At approximately 3 million years ago, modern day man and modern day apes came from a common ancestor. So my question is, this evolution walks up to me and says, you believe that a God created everything? Tell me, where did this God come from? Answer. You can give this every time. I'll be happy to answer that just as soon as you tell me where all the material for the Big Bang came from. Case closed. I mean, you don't have to argue about the universe is expanding and the Bible says this and all that stuff. They have no case. And it was shocking to me when I first did this, but they're so into their science and stuff, it's just amazing to me anyway. Well, here's some notes and comments on atheistic evolution. Atheists do not have to provide an explanation about how the Bible fits in with any of this. And so Richard Dawkins, no problem. He doesn't believe the Bible anyway. Obviously, atheists don't believe that man was made in God's image. Atheists don't really have an explanation as to why there is death and suffering in the world. And we have a lot of non-Christians ask us, if God is so good, how come we see all these people dying and suffering and on and on and on? It's due to Adam and Eve and the curse. It's that simple. It isn't some, really weird explanation or whatever. Death to an atheist evolutionist is normal, and it plays a necessary role in the progress of evolution. All these things have died and then gave rise in their evolution theory to the next generation, on and on for millions of years. So death is normal. So a guy like me to say death is not normal, we're living on plan B. How about number 3? Not atheistic evolution, but theistic evolution. That's maybe God used evolution. And I'll just make this comment because I thought this for years. I mean, I was completely ignorant of this topic many years ago. And maybe God used evolution. My response to that person says, probably you haven't studied enough or you haven't thought about it. Here's some things to think about. I gave a talk at a men's breakfast, and a professor colleague of mine at a university came up to me afterwards and spent an hour telling me how I was fooling the simple Christians in this meeting, and so they don't have to believe in evolution. And he says, why do you're actually hurting the body of Christ. Well, I went to class that next week, and another Christian colleague came up to me and said, did you have a talk with Franz? I said, yeah, it was on Saturday. I said, why? What did he say? He said, Monday gave this creation stuff, and it was pretty compelling. Really? I mean, we don't know what impact we are having on people like this. Several prominent Christians believe this, like Francis Collins and John Walton. Here's the definition: the God-directed process of change in the characteristics of a population of organisms over multiple generations, over millions of years, driven by mutations and natural selection. The sedimentary rock layers with fossils in them are millions, if not billions of years old. And I'll give you a translation, though, because that's a bunch of words. Here's the translation. Theistic evolution basically is God used evolution to create the universe and everything in it. Here's what John Walton, former professor at Moody Bible Institute for 20 years, authored the textbook that they use at Wheaton College for biology majors, and it's on theistic evolution. And their staff presents that they don't believe in creation at all. Now, my granddaughter graduated from there a couple of years ago, and she was pretty convinced that a number of her teachers believed totally in creation, but they felt somewhat intimidated. But he wrote this textbook for that course. They're still teaching it.
In my book, I've tried to show that the account in Genesis 1 is not intended to be an account of material origins. If that's so, the Bible has no narrative of material origins. And if that's so, then we don't have to defend the Bible's narrative of material origins against a scientific narrative, because the Bible doesn't offer one. In that case, we can say, well, if the Bible doesn't offer us a narrative, we can look to science for the narrative.
Well, Walton has authored many, many books on the Old Testament and the Near East. But does this mean that we can look to modern evolutionary science, according to him, to explain Genesis? I think that's what he's saying. Well, what does a theistic evolutionist say? I like doing the raindrop thing, so it's kind of cool. Anyway, they start with nothing, but a theistic evolutionist at least gives credit that there was nothing, but there was a God. And so he got the process rolling, and it goes through the same things over millions of years, and cooling, and planets forming, and animals evolving, and whatever. And then they get out about 3 million years or so ago. Man and apes had a common ancestor. And theistic evolutionists, if they're on their game, most of them are people that you like meet in Sunday school class, and you're talking about that stuff. I'm not being mean. It's just, anyway, modern man and modern apes are split apart about 3.5 million years ago. And so from then on, we have a scenario like this. Genesis was there somehow, God was there somehow, but we evolved. Now, in my opinion, most Christians who hold this view have not studied the issue closely, and I would say I was that way. And there are a lot of issues that I don't understand because I haven't studied them very closely, so I'm not being rude. But theistic evolution does provide an answer for where the material for the Big Bang came from God. However, if you think about it, there are many biblical questions that are hard to resolve if man's origin is the result of long ages of God-directed evolution. A global flood is not a part of this scenario. So someone will say, I believe in theistic evolution. They probably haven't even thought about there's probably a flood somewhere in our history. It's kind of all confusing, sort of like me sometimes. No viable explanation why the earth worldwide is covered in sediments. Wouldn't that be a great explanation? Hey, what do you think? Water lays down sediments and they're all over the world. I wonder if there was a global flood once. What do you think? Were Adam and Eve real people? And where do they fit into the genealogies listed in the Bible, which I showed you in your handout? Death and suffering would have to precede Adam and Eve. What's wrong with that biblically? I can read some of your minds. And some of you are saying, I wish I was somewhere else. No, I'm just kidding. Death and suffering would have to precede Adam and Eve. And then you go, what? If it does, then the whole gospel scenario is based on Adam and Eve's sin. We don't need it. So if there was death before Adam and Eve, and we look at the fossils as millions of years old, and they lived millions, if not billions of years ago, they died before Adam and Eve ever came on the scene. So it's a real big problem. If sin and death came before Adam and Eve, there's no need for a Savior. How about this one? This is relatively new, probably the last 10 years. Evolutionary creation, and it's gaining in popularity. It's a type of theistic evolution that interprets certain passages in the Bible, such as Genesis 1 through 11, as non-literal history. Some modern Christian scholars consider these chapters in Genesis to be mytho-history. This viewpoint holds that contemporary evolutionary science and the Bible are totally compatible. It's a new brand of theistic evolution, and basically, here's what the main adherents say. Evolutionary creation means God created the laws of nature in the universe, like gravity, thermodynamics, motion, light. He also created etc. Anyway, and random evolution proceeded from there. Now, what are some of the problems if you believe evolutionary creation? Modern science, biology, genetics, and paleontology, geology, etc., generally supports the evolutionary history of the universe and its age. That's what they believe, and that's what they teach.
And more often than not, it's the younger creationists who are very passionate that we hold to a literal interpretation of Genesis 1. And if you let go of that, well, then the Bible's the book of lies, or the Christian faith comes crumbling down, or people are going to turn into atheists or whatever. To hold that view is to, among other things, you have to declare war on the vast majority of the scientists who deal with paleontology and geology and all the other sciences that are predicated on evolutionary theory.
Greg Boyd is a pastor of a megachurch, and he thinks Christians and creationists put too much emphasis on that. Now, here's a guy by the name of Carl Geibertson. He was a physicist, and he taught at Stonehill Roman Catholic College. And he was a former evangelical, that's how he listed his biography, contends that literal belief in Genesis leads many Christians to reject science and become intellectually isolated. And he's the author of the book, Saving the Original Sinner.
And the foreword to your book is written by Francis Collin, and he does, so yes, you can. Lots of people do. But is it logically consistent to do so? I mean, lots of people believe inconsistent things as well, so how do you reconcile Christianity and evolution?
Well, I mean, I think it's not so much a matter of reconciling them as kind of recognizing that they don't make as much contact with each other as a lot of people think. I mean, Christianity is mainly about God's revelation in Christ and how that's understood, and it's hard to see how evolutionary theory really connects to that one way or the other, either to support or refute it. And I think it's only if we get distracted by the first couple of chapters of Genesis and elevate them in importance beyond what's appropriate that we have a real conflict.
If we get distracted by Genesis, we're going off script. Amazing, isn't it? The first 11 chapters of Genesis are mytho-history and are not to be taken literally. And this guy, William Lane Craig, I met this guy more than 40 years ago when he was just starting out. He has 2 PhDs. He was in an apologetics ministry, so our church sent him out. And he debates people in big forums, like, is there a God or no God, and some of those issues. He's pretty good at some of that. But this is what I found when I went up to talk to him. When they introduced him at church, and I'm just this little bunky guy, 35 years old or whatever, I said, have you been studying creation at all? And he says, not really. I said, have you heard of guys like Henry Morris, John Morris, Steve Austin, Dwayne Gish? He said, no. And I'm rather a low-key person. You probably know that. And so I just walked away, and I thought, you know what? He's probably going to get prepared if he has to debate an evolutionist. That's what I thought. And then years later, I found that he never has read it, and he thinks Henry Morris and all these other guys. I've had a course from Henry Morris. I went with John Morris and Steve Austin to Mount St. Helens.
I think there are very persuasive reasons to think that Genesis 1 to 11 belongs to this genre of mytho-history, and that therefore it's a mistake to take it as a literalistic historical narrative.
He's very well respected in educational circles. They believe Adam and Eve were not real historic people. And as Guybertson says, unfortunately, the concepts of Adam and Eve as the literal first couple and the ancestors of all humans simply do not fit the evidence. And then we get back to William Lane Craig. His latest book is In Quest of the Historical Adam. And he has a whole thing laying out why this evolutionary creation stuff works.
I think that the best way to coordinate the scientific and biblical data is to push Adam and Eve way back into the past so that they are the ancestors not only of Homo sapiens but also of Neanderthals.
These are the people that are teaching at our Christian seminaries and Christian colleges, and the teachers who teach there are listening to some of these people.
So, by way of my final conclusion, who was the ancestor of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals? Well, it was a hominin called Heidelberg man. And you can look him up on Wikipedia if you want to read more about Heidelberg man. But I think that he was probably Adam and Eve, or Adam and Eve did belong to the species Heidelberg man. And he was not some kind of an ape man or something like that. He was an intelligent, gifted, and cognitively modern human being, which is ancestral to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
And these people also have to answer the same things that I mentioned about theistic evolution, but they have to talk about when did God put a soul in who? And, stuff, just basic things like that. And one of these guys that I talked to said he is having trouble with not being able to fit original sin with Adam and Eve. There never was a global flood. Are you kidding me?
Take, for example, the attempt to explain away the Earth's sedimentation on the basis of so-called flood geology, Noah's flood. The idea that there was ever a worldwide flood that destroyed all terrestrial life on Earth and laid down the Earth's sediments is a fantasy.
Can you imagine a guy with 2 PhDs, one in theology and philosophy and all that stuff? With his education, he's spoken at millions of Christian things. And that's what he believes. There wasn't any global flood. Here's a few notes that I would add on to creation, evolutionary creation. Here's a few notes. Now, I gave you these before, so I'm just going to jettison them and say the notes and comments that I have are similar to theistic evolution arguments, same problem. But here's some others. They're often promoted by Christian intellectuals. Advocates of this belief may view six-day literal creationists as out of touch with mainstream science. Adherents of this belief are often unfamiliar with scientific arguments that support a six-day literal creation. And in fact, I've read a number of their books, and some of them have kind of a rudimentary knowledge of what creationists believe. They don't have the whole story usually, but they're completely unaware of the evidence, or they reject the evidence from like Answers in Genesis or Ken Ham and Henry Morris and all those guys. They really don't have a grasp of it though, because I've read them making statements about what creationists believe that are not true. People who hold this view may consider six-day literal creationists a hindrance to the gospel. I think I already told you that one professor in the university I taught at said I was actually doing a disservice to say this stuff. So look out. That's why I call it the enemy within. We have false teaching about origins creeping into the church, and it started probably in around 2006. So it's around 20 years old or whatever. And it was founded by a guy by the name of Francis Collins. But we'll take a look at it. We'll enter BioLogos. Now I'm on all these people's email lists, and it's fascinating. I mean, I learn a lot. Anyway, brief history of BioLogos. Founded in 2007 by Francis Collins, the BioLogos Foundation is a Christian advocacy group that supports the view that God created the world using the evolution of different species as the mechanism. And here's what the guy who started it. Now, Francis Collins is a heavyweight in science. And I remember I went to 2 different universities for my degrees in science. And I tried to take courses where the professor had written the book. You know, I mean, it's pretty cool as for a young guy. And I was really impressed with these guys. And Francis Collins is an amazing, impressive scientist. Notice he graduated from high school at 16. He's already isolated genes for cystic fibrosis, neurofibromatosis, Huntington's disease, etc. And he's won numerous awards. But he's very outspoken about six-day literal creationists and anyone who could possibly believe in Adam and Eve and things like that. This is his best-selling book. It came out probably in 2008, 2007, something like that. And here's what Kenneth Miller said in his review. Refuting the tired stereotypes of hostility between science and religion, Francis Collins challenges his readers to find a unity of knowledge that encompasses both faith and reason. And he says, the data are clear that humans have been created through an evolutionary process, and there was never a time when there was a single first couple, 2 people who were the progenitors of the entire human race. And then he reflects, might Genesis be presenting a poetic and powerful allegory, or maybe mythical history? And he states for BioLogos, within that framework, BioLogos does not take a position on the existence in history of 2 unique individuals, Adam and Eve. This is a theological question, not a scientific one. And we've all probably known, I mentioned it before, that there's a lot of things I don't know about it, you know, relatively ignorant on how to fly a plane and things like that. He's a brilliant man in science. And at the universities that I went to, some of these people were amazing, and it was wonderful being taught science from them. I didn't take a lot of evolution, it was just kind of understood. But they could be wrong.
Hey, I'm Dan Harris, and as a reporter who often covers issues of faith, I've met many evangelical Christians who are dead set against the theory of evolution. In fact, I've been down to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, where they have a big display that shows dinosaurs coexisting with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now comes Dr. Francis Collins, who's a devout Christian and also a very serious scientist. In fact, he led the charge to map the human genome. And Dr. Francis Collins has a new mission, which is to take on his fellow believers on the issue of evolution. I have to imagine that some evangelicals get very upset with you.
I've certainly gotten some emails that curled my hair.
Really?
I've been called a wolf in sheep's clothing. I've been excommunicated a couple of times, although I'm not Catholic. I mean, people do get pretty upset.
Wonder why.
Well, let me press you on that. I mean, the Genesis would leave us to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. And it would lead us to believe that God created 2 human beings, one out of the rib of the other. It's pretty explicit stuff.
We interpret it as explicit these days. It is not a textbook of science. It would not have suited God's purposes to lecture to his chosen people about radioactive decay and such things as DNA.
Adam and Eve obviously couldn't tell about what God did and told them because they didn't know about radioactive decay.
Francis, does the theory of evolution, which everyone should accept, does it require biologists to be agnostics or atheists if they are to have a coherent worldview?
Obviously, this is a fundamental question for anybody who's aware of what's happening in biology. Certainly, evolution as a way of explaining the relatedness of living things is no longer in question. The data, somewhat from the fossil record, but more recently from the study of DNA, is incontrovertible. You can't look at that evidence and not conclude that living things, including ourselves, are all related by descent from a common ancestor.
I would bet a lot of people in this room could look at the evidence and get a different endpoint. BioLogos is gaining popularity among Christian intellectuals, so you may be hearing them interviewed on radio sometime, TV. BioLogos is alluring because it's promoted by high-profile scientists and theologians. And it's appealing because it melds modern theology with modern science. Currently, BioLogos this month is having a science is good push. And so if you're in contact with them or get their emails, they want to take the mystery out of science, and basically mainstream science is pretty good, and all the stuff these creationists are saying about them is just a crack. They're well funded. And wouldn't you like that to drive up to your house? Anyway, they're well funded with the Templeton Foundation. They do ask for donations. They do charge for some of their meetings. But here are their goals stated in their literature. Demonstrate there really are no conflicts between modern Christianity and modern science. Reach as many universities, colleges, seminaries, and churches with evolutionary creation. Debunk the arguments for intelligent design and, oh no, young earth creation. What are their strategies? Put on seminars at little or no cost to universities, Christian colleges, and seminaries. Who would not, if you're not up on this stuff, I'd say most people aren't. I'm not up on IA. I thought there were 2 letters of the alphabet. I know there's more to it than that. But I'm not up on a lot of stuff. But these professors, I remember talking to a seminary professor who said to me, I finally figured out where Adam and Eve came from, and it was just some real bizarre answer. And I don't want to name the theological seminary because I don't know if he teaches there anymore. I don't want to give him a bad name or whatever. But a lot of these real intellectual types have no idea what evidence there is in science. Offer churches $15,000 grants to allow BioLogos to put on presentations of evolutionary creation. So if you have a small congregation and they're up to this, they'll give you $15,000 if you want to have them come. I don't like that. I see a number of you writing that down. Offer huge grants of money to seminaries, Christian universities, colleges, for the purpose of studying and researching various creation topics. And then we can talk all about, and how about original sin? How does that fit in? Provide educational materials, homeschool curricula, I mentioned that before, videos, internet support for people who want to teach this view. Well, there are some consequences to accepting this view, and what are some of them? Seminaries and churches are placing their faith in secular science regarding our origins rather than God's Word. So it would not surprise me if you have a grandchild or a child going to a Christian school and they come home and say they teach evolution. I called a professor. This is amazing. If you want to ask me afterwards, but I called a professor at a Christian college, well-known Christian college, not Wheaton, and he had written an article in the NABT, the National Association of Biology Teachers. So I thought, that's pretty amazing for a Christian guy. And he was voted president. Well, I called him and talked to him on the phone, And I said, hey, Mr. Moore, what do you think about creation in your Christian college and everything? I'm not a real confrontational person. He says, well, we don't get into that too much. I said, well, I have a book by a guy named Walt Brown, and I am willing to drive to your university, which is a couple hundred miles away, and give you the book, and you can read it, and I'll discuss it with you. Here was his answer. I'm sorry, that's nice that you do that, but I can't accept gifts from outside people, and we can't use that here at our school. Pretty good answer, huh? In other words, I don't want this idiot coming to my house. Here's BioLogos educational material. Homeschool stuff. Now you think about it. We homeschooled our kids, and this was back in the 80s. There wasn't a whole lot of homeschool stuff at the time. And if you saw a curriculum from a Christian organization for homeschool, you'd at least take a look at it. And here's some of the booklets that they've printed that you can buy for $99, and they come with worksheets, explanations, and all kinds of different things to have the student interact. And some of them aren't really that bad. The cell, a cell in design. We all have had that in our Christian education. I would like to at least hear what Collins had to say about ethics. Did you know he was partnered with Anthony Fauci? Yeah, they worked on the COVID thing together. I don't know if you knew that. At least you're not throwing stuff. Thank you. Here's a nice title, Seeing God in Creation, and we all can. But here are some of the other titles that I would really be suspect of. Bible Interpretation and Science, i.e., our interpretation of science and what we think of the Bible. The Fossil Record and Faith. Does the fossil record support the theory of evolution? What do you think their answer is in these pages? They have, really good writers and things like that, but it's a bunch of bunk. Evolution and God's creation. Can accepting evolution be a faithful option for Christians? Humans and the rest of creation. And there's a whole bunch of other things. And they have videos and other types of things. You can go on their website. Well, one of your handouts, and it looks like we're about time to close. Don't pack up yet, I'm almost done. Creation resources. I just listed some on your handouts of things that you might want to know about and that will build your faith in this topic. You see my favorite one up there is Creation Magazine. And the Creation Museum, Ark Encounter, you've got to go there. The Lord gave me the opportunity to see the Ark a couple days before they opened it to the public. And if you've never been there, you've got to give it a shot. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And then Answers Magazine, they have 6 issues now, and it's Answers in Genesis. They go into more than just creation. And I kind of like, for the audience that I deal with high school kids and things like that, Creation Magazine. What else can we do, Mr. Mondy? Well, contact your church leadership. That'd be scary, wouldn't it? I want to talk to you. Videos. Have a guest speaker. MCF has videos and guest speakers. Invite apologetic ministries in. Have a church offer a course in it. Every 2 years in the church that I go to, I teach the high school and junior high kids a seminar on creation for 6 Sundays. And it is amazing some of the responses you get, because you think, you work with those kids, those pimply little... There are so many wonderful Christian kids, and all of them, because I spent a lot of my career working with behavior disordered students as well. Christ died for them. But in our church, they get a really good education on a lot of stuff. There's a lot of neat Christian kids. Bring a speaker or something like that to your church. And then ask someone, we don't have all the seats filled in here, so ask someone to go with you to our next MCF meeting. Now you're supposed to start writing. MCF, what are those letters again? And then you can do the cartoon quotes yourself. Okay, and we're almost done. What have we learned? There are many scenarios that have been suggested to explain the formation of the universe and the origin of life. Some scholars prefer to leave God out of several of these scenarios. Many very bright people believe that various descriptions of evolution are most likely to explain how we got here. And the theory of evolutionary creation is gaining in popularity and is a very real threat to God's Word and Christianity. I met a girl who went off to a Christian college, and she came home at Christmas, and she said, they teach evolution there. They don't know what you taught in our class. Here's one other one. Biblical creation is the only reasonable explanation that's supported by both science and God's Word. And I'm going to leave you with a quote, a video quote of Dr. Raymond Damadian, the guy who invented the MRI machine in the late 1960s. Of course, that was such an unbelievable deal, but they decided to not give him the Nobel Prize, so that they gave Nobel Prizes to the two guys who picked up his research and refined it. Why do you think that is? Well, listen to his testimony.
Hi, my name is Dr. Raymond Damadian. I am a young Earth creation scientist and believe that God created the world in 6 24-hour days, just as recorded in the book of Genesis. By God's grace and the devoted prayers of my godly mother-in-law, I invented the MRI scanner in 1969. The idea that scientists who believe the Earth is 6,000 years old cannot do real science is simply wrong.
And this may be in horrible taste, but that's the end of this presentation. Do you have questions or whatever?